In the autumn of 1908, in a valley where mist clung to ancient pines like burial shrouds, there stood a settlement called Stillwater. The name promised peace, but those who lived there knew better. They spoke in whispers of the Croft family, of their workshop that reeked of chemicals and death, and of the boy whose small hands had learned to work with needle and thread in ways that defied nature. Travelers who passed through claimed the taxidermist's specimens were too lifelike, their glass eyes too knowing. Local children crossed themselves when they glimpsed young Abel Croft walking the forest paths, his silent footsteps leaving no sound on the fallen leaves. What they whispered in the darkness was that the boy had learned more than preservation from his father. Before we go on, tell me in the comments where you are watching from. If this is your first time here, subscribe because the story I am about to tell goes beyond anything you can imagine. But to understand how a 12-year-old child could learn to silence a man forever, we must first understand the place where screams echoed against mountains and were swallowed by the trees. What if a child's education in preservation was actually a lesson in something far more sinister? In the remote logging settlement of Stillwater, nestled deep within the Blackroot Valley, such an education allegedly took place. The Croft workshop, with its chemical reek and unnaturally quiet atmosphere, served as both classroom and laboratory for young Abel Croft, son of the town's reclusive taxidermist. The legend speaks of a boy who learned to work with flesh not as a craft, but as a language. His father, Elias Croft, was known throughout the valley for specimens so lifelike they seemed ready to draw breath. What the townspeople didn't know was that Elias had discovered methods of preservation that went far beyond anything taught in natural philosophy books. Abel Croft didn't simply learn to stuff animals. According to whispered accounts and fragmentary records, he learned to read the architecture of life itself, to understand how sinew connected to bone, how flesh could be manipulated and preserved in ways that served purposes darker than mere display. His education culminated in a single horrific demonstration of everything his father had taught him. The workshop where this education took place still haunts the memories of those few survivors who remember Stillwater before it was abandoned. They describe the sound of dripping that never ceased, the smell of formaldehyde mixed with something more organic, more disturbing. They remember the boy's hands, always stained with chemicals, always steady despite his youth. What no one realized was that Abel Croft's education had prepared him for something unthinkable. The preservation techniques, the anatomical knowledge, the steady hands that never trembled. These were not just skills being passed from father to son. They were weapons being forged in the hands of a child who would soon discover he was intended to be his father's final, most perfect creation. The claim that emerges from the scattered records is simple, yet chilling. Abel Croft learned his father's darkest secrets, and when he realized he was meant to become the next subject in Elias's collection, he turned those lessons against their teacher. The workshop that had been his school became his father's tomb, and the boy who had learned to stitch flesh used that knowledge to ensure his father would never speak again. The Blackroot Valley carved itself into the mountains like a wound that never healed. Dense forests of pine and fir pressed against each other so tightly that noon felt like dusk, and even the hardiest loggers spoke of places where their axes would not bite, where the trees seemed to watch and wait. This was the world that shaped Stillwater, a settlement that existed only because men needed somewhere to sleep between cutting down the forest. The valley itself defied easy description. Mist rose from the valley floor each morning and never fully lifted, creating a perpetual twilight that muffled sound and distorted distance. The single road that connected Stillwater to the outside world was little more than a muddy track that became impassable in winter, leaving the settlement isolated for months at a time. In such a place, secrets could take root and flourish like mushrooms in rotting wood. Stillwater consisted of perhaps 30 buildings, most of them rough-hewn structures built to house the loggers and their families. The company store, the foreman's house, a small church that saw irregular use, and scattered cabins where families tried to carve out lives in the wilderness. At the settlement's edge, separated from the others by a stretch of boggy ground and a screen of young pines, stood the Croft property. The Croft house was a modest structure, 2 stories of weathered wood with windows that seemed always to be curtained. But it was the workshop, a separate building connected to the house by a covered walkway, that drew the eye and unsettled the spirit. Built larger than the house itself, the workshop had been designed with specific purposes in mind. High windows allowed natural light to fall on work surfaces, while a complex system of pulleys and hooks hung from the rafters like the rigging of some landlocked ship. The workshop's most distinctive feature was its smell. Even from a distance, the chemical reek of formaldehyde and tanning agents hung in the air, mixed with other odors that neighbors couldn't quite identify. Some claimed to detect the metallic scent of blood. Others swore they smelled something sweeter, more cloying, like flowers left too long in a vase. All agreed that the smell was wrong somehow, that it spoke of processes better left unexamined. This was a place where sounds themselves seemed to die. The constant drip of condensation from the workshop's eaves created a rhythm that became part of the valley's silence, a metronome marking time in a place where time seemed to move differently. Workers returning from the logging sites would quicken their pace when passing the Croft property, and children were forbidden from playing near the boggy ground that surrounded it. The isolation that defined the valley also defined the people who lived there. They were a community bound together by necessity and mutual dependence, but also by unspoken agreements about what questions not to ask and what sounds to ignore. In such a place, the Croft family's peculiarities might have seemed merely eccentric rather than sinister, if not for the quality of Elias's work and the unsettling silence of his son. Elias Croft possessed hands that never trembled, eyes that missed no detail, and a patience that bordered on the supernatural. Those who dealt with him described a man of few words, who approached his craft with the dedication of a scholar and the precision of a surgeon. He was tall and lean, his dark hair perpetually unkempt, his clothes always carrying the chemical smell of his workshop. When he spoke, which was rarely, his voice carried an odd formality, as if he were translating his thoughts from some other language. The townspeople respected Elias for his skill and feared him for reasons they couldn't articulate. His specimens were works of art, creatures so perfectly preserved that visitors sometimes jumped when expecting to see them breathe. Bears stood on hind legs with their claws extended, as if frozen mid-swipe. Wolves crouched with lips pulled back to reveal fangs that gleamed like ivory. Birds perched with wings spread as if caught in the moment before flight. But it was the eyes that truly unsettled observers. Glass eyes, carefully selected and positioned, that seemed to follow movement across a room. Elias possessed some technique for setting them that no other taxidermist could replicate. The eyes held an awareness, a depth that suggested consciousness might linger in the preserved flesh. Children refused to enter rooms where his specimens were displayed, claiming they felt watched. Abel Croft, at 12 years old, had already absorbed much of his father's knowledge. Small for his age, but with hands as steady as his father's, he moved through the workshop with quiet efficiency. Unlike other children his age, Abel rarely spoke and never played. His education consisted entirely of observing his father's work and gradually taking on more complex tasks under Elias's stern supervision. The relationship between father and son was built on observation rather than conversation. Elias would demonstrate a technique once, perhaps twice, Then expect Abel to replicate it perfectly. The boy learned to read his father's moods through subtle signs, the way Elias held his shoulders when displeased, the slight narrowing of his eyes when a procedure wasn't executed to his satisfaction. Words were unnecessary in the Croft workshop. Communication flowed through gesture and example. Abel's apprenticeship began with simple tasks: mixing chemicals, preparing tools, cleaning work surfaces. As his skills developed, he progressed to more complex work: skinning small animals, preparing specimens for mounting, positioning glass eyes with the same uncanny precision his father demonstrated. By the time he turned 12, Abel could complete most procedures independently, working in the same focused silence that characterized his father. The workshop itself served as their shared language. Every tool had its proper place, every chemical its specific purpose, every procedure its established order. Father and son moved through the space like dancers following familiar choreography, each anticipating the other's needs, each contributing to processes that produced results admired throughout the valley and beyond. Visitors to the workshop often remarked on the boy's unusual maturity, his adult-like focus on tasks that would disturb most children. They noted how Abel seemed unaffected by the sight of blood or the smell of decay, how he handled dead animals with the same casual efficiency his father displayed. What they couldn't see was how this education was shaping the boy's understanding of the world, teaching him to see living things primarily in terms of their potential for preservation. The invoice from Finch and Sons Medical Supply, discovered years later, revealed the true scope of the Crofts' operations. Orders for arsenic in quantities far exceeding what any legitimate taxidermist would require, formalin purchased in industrial amounts, surgical instruments of a quality and specificity that suggested uses beyond animal preservation. The pattern of orders, their timing and quantities, painted a picture of activities that extended far beyond the workshop's apparent purpose. Pastor Josiah Anselm arrived in Stillwater during the autumn of 1907, carrying with him the optimism of a man who believed civilization could take root anywhere men gathered in God's name. Fresh from seminary and assigned to bring order to what church authorities described as a lawless settlement, he came prepared to battle worldly sins: drinking, gambling, violence born of isolation and desperation. He was not prepared for the more subtle corruptions that flourished in the valley's perpetual twilight. The pastor's first impression of Stillwater was one of profound melancholy. The settlement huddled against the mountainside like something trying to hide from observation. Its buildings arranged without plan or purpose. The church he'd been sent to revive was a small structure whose windows had been boarded shut and whose pulpit showed signs of having been used as a chopping block. It would take weeks to make the building suitable for worship, but Anselm threw himself into the task with determined cheerfulness. During his initial weeks in Stillwater, the pastor made efforts to meet his new congregation. He visited the loggers in their camps, shared meals with families in their cramped cabins, and listened to the complaints of women who felt trapped in a place where winter lasted 8 months and civilization seemed little more than a memory. Most welcomed his presence, hungry for contact with the outside world and the comfort of familiar rituals. It was widow Martha Clay who first mentioned the Crofts to Pastor Anselm, a woman whose black dresses and sharp tongue made her the settlement's unofficial keeper of moral standards. She cornered the pastor after his first successful service and proceeded to catalog every sin and scandal she'd observed during her years in Stillwater. Most of her complaints involved drinking, adultery, or violence, matters the pastor felt equipped to address through counsel and prayer. But Martha's account of the hunter who disappeared 2 winters prior struck a different note. She spoke of Edmund Holcomb, a man who arrived in Stillwater seeking work but found only odd jobs and charity. Holcomb had made himself unpopular through his drinking and his tendency to make unwelcome advances toward women. But he was still a human being deserving of Christian concern when he vanished without explanation during a particularly harsh winter storm. What troubled Martha, and what she felt compelled to share with the pastor, was the timing of Holcomb's disappearance. She had observed Elias Croft receiving what appeared to be a large, fresh specimen around the same time the hunter vanished. The delivery occurred at night, transported in a cart covered with canvas, and carried into the workshop by Elias and another man she couldn't identify in the darkness. Martha's suspicions might have remained simple gossip, but she possessed a talent for observation that made her accounts more credible than most. She noted specific details: the way the canvas bulged, the care required to maneuver the burden through the workshop door, the fact that Elias worked through the night with his lamps burning bright. Most significantly, she observed that young Abel had been present during the delivery, helping his father with an ease that suggested such nocturnal activities were not unusual. Pastor Anselm listened to Martha's account with the polite attention he gave all his parishioners' concerns, but privately dismissed it as the product of an active imagination and too much isolation. He thanked her for bringing the matter to his attention and promised to observe the Croft family during their interactions with the community. It was a promise he would later regret not taking more seriously. The pastor's first direct encounter with the Crofts came when Elias visited the church to examine the building's structural condition. The taxidermist's offer to repair the damaged pulpit seemed generous, and his skilled carpentry quickly restored the platform to better condition than it had enjoyed in years. During the work, Anselm attempted conversation, asking about Elias's trade and expressing interest in seeing examples of his craft. Elias responded to these overtures with polite but minimal answers, deflecting personal questions and focusing entirely on the carpentry work at hand. It was Abel's presence that truly unsettled the pastor. The boy assisted his father with perfect efficiency, anticipating needs and providing tools without being asked, but he never spoke and rarely made eye contact. When Anselm addressed him directly, Abel would look to his father before responding, and his responses consisted only of nods or single-word answers. It was a story the pastor filed away until he met the boy and saw the unsettling quality of his work for himself. The arrival of Cornelius Ashworth in Stillwater during the spring of 1908 brought with it the first hint of the larger forces that would soon tear the settlement apart. Ashworth was everything the local residents were not: impeccably dressed, well-educated, and possessed of the kind of wealth that made him comfortable in any circumstance. He claimed to represent Eastern interests, looking to invest in timber operations, but his true purpose became clear only when he visited the Croft workshop. Silas Granger, the settlement's foreman and its closest approximation to a leader, served as Ashworth's guide during his week-long visit. Granger showed the investor the logging operations, the quality of the timber, and the potential for expansion if sufficient capital could be secured. But it was their visit to Elias Croft's workshop that seemed to capture Ashworth's genuine interest. The workshop tour began as a courtesy, something to occupy an hour while discussing business matters. But when Ashworth saw Elias's work, his entire demeanor changed. He examined specimen after specimen with growing excitement, asking detailed questions about preservation techniques and marveling at the lifelike quality of the mounted animals. He spent particular attention on a large grizzly bear that dominated one corner of the workshop, its pose so natural that visitors often startled when expecting it to move. What impressed Ashworth most was not just the technical skill displayed in the specimens, but their artistic quality. These were not mere preserved animals, but works of art that captured something essential about the creature's nature. The grizzly bear radiated power and menace, even in death, while a collection of forest birds seemed poised for flight despite their glass eyes and wire frames. Ashworth claimed he'd never seen work of such quality, even in the finest museums of New York and Philadelphia. Elias received these compliments with characteristic reserve, but Pastor Anselm, who happened to be present during the visit, noticed subtle changes in the taxidermist's behavior. There was a tension in Elias's posture, a watchfulness in his eyes that suggested Ashworth's enthusiasm made him uncomfortable rather than pleased. When Ashworth began asking specific questions about techniques and materials, Elias's answers became increasingly evasive. The discussion took a decisive turn when Ashworth made his proposal. He wanted to commission a masterpiece, something that would serve as the centerpiece of his private collection in Boston. Money was no object, he explained, and he was willing to pay whatever price Elias deemed appropriate for truly exceptional work. The subject matter would be left to the artist's discretion, with only one requirement. The final result must be something that would astonish and disturb viewers in equal measure. Elias's initial response was to decline the commission, citing his commitment to local clients and his preference for working with familiar subjects. But Ashworth pressed the matter, increasing his offered payment to a sum that represented more money than most Stillwater residents would see in several years. The negotiation continued over several days, with Ashworth's persistence eventually overcoming Elias's reluctance. The final agreement, sealed with a bank draft that served as partial payment, committed Elias to completing the masterpiece within 6 months. The subject would be Ashworth's choice from among several options Elias would propose, and the finished work would be shipped to Boston at Ashworth's expense. Most importantly for future events, the commission included a clause guaranteeing complete discretion, with both parties agreeing never to discuss the work's creation or content. Young Abel observed these negotiations from the workshop's shadows, his usual silent presence made even more unobtrusive by the intensity of the adult conversation. But those who knew him well, particularly Pastor Anselm, noticed changes in the boy's behavior following Ashworth's visit. Abel became more withdrawn than usual, spending long hours alone in the workshop, even when his father was absent. His appetite decreased, and the dark circles under his eyes suggested sleep had become elusive. This commission would set in motion a chain of events, beginning with Elias looking at his son not as an apprentice, but as a potential canvas. The investigation that would eventually expose the full scope of Elias Croft's activities began not with official suspicion, but with Pastor Anselm's growing unease about the family's behavior. The pastor's faith had always been strengthened by his ability to find good in even the most troubled souls, but the Crofts presented him with a challenge that tested both his optimism and his understanding of human nature. Following Ashworth's visit, changes in the Croft household became impossible to ignore. Elias worked longer hours, often keeping his workshop lamps burning well past midnight. The chemical smell that always surrounded the property intensified, becoming so strong that neighbors complained of headaches when the wind blew from that direction. Most disturbing was the increase in nocturnal deliveries, canvas-covered loads that arrived without warning and disappeared into the workshop under cover of darkness. Pastor Anselm's investigation began accidentally when he discovered Abel's sketchbook during a visit to repair a broken window in the Croft house. The boy had left the book on a kitchen table, its pages filled with drawings that demonstrated both artistic talent and disturbing preoccupations. The early sketches showed woodland animals in various poses, anatomically correct studies that revealed a deep understanding of animal structure and movement. But as Anselm leafed through the pages, the subject matter evolved in ways that made his hands tremble. Animals gave way to human figures, first drawn from life, but gradually becoming more clinical, more focused on internal structure than external appearance. Detailed studies of human musculature, skeletal systems, and circulatory patterns filled page after page, executed with the same precision Abel brought to his animal studies. The final pages of the sketchbook contained diagrams that defied easy interpretation, complex illustrations showing human forms in various poses, but with notations that seemed to reference preservation techniques rather than artistic studies. Measurements, chemical formulas, and procedural notes filled the margins, written in Abel's careful handwriting but dealing with subjects no 12-year-old should comprehend. When Pastor Anselm confronted Abel about the sketchbook's contents, the boy's response was both heartbreaking and terrifying. Abel explained in his characteristic few words that his father had instructed him to study human anatomy as the next phase of his education. The drawings were homework, assignments given to prepare him for more advanced work in the family trade. When pressed about the specific nature of this advanced work, Abel became silent and withdrawn, but his eyes carried a fear that spoke louder than words. The discovery of Silas Granger's correspondence provided the final piece of the puzzle. Hidden among the foreman's papers, Pastor Anselm found letters that revealed the true scope of the operation. Granger served not just as Stillwater's administrator, but as a supplier for Elias's clandestine activities. The letters, addressed to various wealthy collectors in eastern cities, detailed the availability of specimens for private collections with promises of quality and discretion that spoke of an established business relationship. One letter, dated several months before Ashworth's visit, was particularly damning. Granger wrote to someone identified only as Mr. P about the successful acquisition of another specimen for your collection. The letter praised Elias's preparation skills and promised that discretion would be maintained as always. The correspondence made clear that what happened in Stillwater was part of a larger network, a supply chain that fed the appetites of collectors whose tastes ran to the forbidden and macabre. The human specimens were sourced from the valley's most vulnerable inhabitants, transients, hunters, trappers, who worked alone and might disappear without raising immediate alarm. Granger's position as foreman gave him access to information about who was working where and when they might be expected to return. Those who failed to return were simply assumed to have been claimed by the wilderness, another casualty of a dangerous profession in an unforgiving environment. Elias's role was to transform these victims into works of art, using preservation techniques that went far beyond anything taught in conventional taxidermy. His methods produced results that satisfied the most discriminating collectors, clients who paid premium prices for specimens that combined scientific accuracy with artistic vision. The workshop's chemical smell, the nocturnal deliveries, the unusual orders from medical suppliers, all made sense when viewed through this horrific lens. But as Abel's understanding grew, so too did his fear as he overheard his father discussing the ultimate peace with his patron. Margaret Mute Maggie Hennessy was perhaps the only person in Stillwater who truly understood what was happening in the Croft workshop, despite, or perhaps because of, her inability to speak. Born with a condition that left her voiceless, Maggie had developed other means of communication that made her extraordinarily observant of human behavior and uncommonly sensitive to the unspoken tensions that shaped her community. At 15 years old, Maggie served as an unofficial caretaker for her father, a trapper who spent weeks at a time in the wilderness checking his lines. During these long periods of solitude, she roamed the settlement freely, moving through the forest with a silence that rivaled Abel Croft's own ghost-like presence. Her muteness made adults comfortable discussing sensitive matters in her presence, assuming she couldn't repeat what she heard even if she understood it. But Maggie understood far more than anyone realized. She had developed a sophisticated system of communication using gestures, drawings, and expressions that allowed her to convey complex ideas to those willing to pay attention. Pastor Anselm was among the few adults who treated her as a full person rather than a curiosity, taking time to learn her methods of expression and to value her unique perspective on the community's hidden dynamics. It was Maggie who first recognized the change in Abel Croft's behavior following Ashworth's commission. She had observed the boy for years, noting his unusual relationship with his father and his premature introduction to adult responsibilities. But in the weeks after the wealthy stranger's visit, she detected a fear in Abel that went beyond normal childhood anxieties. The boy moved differently, constantly glancing over his shoulder, startling at unexpected sounds. Maggie's most significant observation occurred during one of her nocturnal wanderings through the settlement. Unable to sleep due to her father's absence and the strange sounds that seemed to emanate from the Croft workshop, she had positioned herself where she could observe the building without being detected. What she saw that night would haunt her for the rest of her life and ultimately provide the key evidence needed to understand the tragedy that was unfolding. Through the workshop's high windows, Maggie observed Elias Croft preparing what appeared to be a demonstration for his son. The scene was lit by multiple oil lamps that cast dancing shadows on the walls, creating a theatrical atmosphere that made the activities inside seem even more disturbing. Elias moved with his characteristic precision, arranging tools on a work surface while Abel watched from a position near the door. What made the scene particularly terrifying was Abel's obvious distress. Even from her distant vantage point, Maggie could see the boy's rigid posture, his clenched fists. His face turned toward the floor as if he couldn't bear to watch what his father was demonstrating. When Elias gestured for Abel to approach the work surface, the boy's reluctance was palpable, each step taken with visible effort. The demonstration itself was partially obscured by the workshop's interior arrangement, but Maggie could see enough to understand that Elias was showing Abel techniques that went beyond normal taxidermy procedures. The movements were too precise, too clinical, too focused on anatomical details that seemed to involve human rather than animal subjects. When Elias handed Abel a scalpel and guided his hand through a specific motion, the boy's entire body shook with suppressed terror. Most disturbing was what happened when the demonstration concluded. Elias placed both hands on Abel's shoulders and spoke to him at length, his posture suggesting a combination of instruction and threat. Abel listened without moving, but Maggie could see tears streaming down his face in the lamplight. When his father finally released him, Abel stumbled toward the workshop door as if his legs could barely support his weight. Maggie's attempts to communicate what she had witnessed to Pastor Anselm were initially frustrated by the complexity of the concepts she was trying to convey. Her usual methods of expression, adequate for everyday communication, proved insufficient for describing the horror she had observed. But through a combination of dramatic gestures, rough drawings, and patient repetition, she eventually managed to convey the essential elements. Abel was terrified of his father, and whatever was happening in the workshop was building toward something that would destroy the boy. The crude drawing Maggie created to illustrate her concerns showed two figures, one large and one small, with the larger figure holding what appeared to be a knife, while the smaller figure cowered in fear. The artistic quality was primitive, but the emotional content was unmistakable. This was not a scene of instruction or normal family discipline, but a portrait of a child facing mortal danger from the person who should have been his protector. Pastor Anselm's faith in rational explanations began to fracture when he saw Maggie's drawing and understood what she was trying to tell him. The girl's reputation for truthfulness, combined with his own growing suspicions about the Croft family, made it impossible to dismiss her testimony as the product of imagination or misunderstanding. Something was happening in the workshop that placed Abel in immediate danger, and the pastor felt compelled to intervene. Rushing to the Croft house, Pastor Anselm was prepared for a confrontation, but nothing could have prepared him for the silence that greeted him. The morning of November 10th, 1908, dawned gray and cold, with frost covering the settlement like a burial shroud. Pastor Anselm had spent a sleepless night, wrestling with Maggie's testimony and his own growing certainty that Abel Croft was in mortal danger. As soon as daylight made travel safe, he set out for the Croft property, accompanied by Silas Granger, whose position as foreman gave him authority to investigate any situation that might threaten the settlement's stability. The two men approached the Croft house with mounting unease. The usual sounds that indicated human habitation were absent. No smoke rose from the chimney. No movement could be detected behind the curtained windows. No footprints marked the frost-covered path between house and workshop. The chemical smell that normally pervaded the area seemed muted, as if the processes that created it had been suspended. Granger knocked on the house's front door, his calls for Elias and Abel echoing unanswered in the cold air. When repeated knocking produced no response, the foreman tested the door and found it unlocked. Unusual for a family that normally maintained strict privacy. Inside, the house showed no signs of disturbance, but felt abandoned, as if its occupants had simply vanished during the night. The kitchen contained evidence of interrupted activity, a half-eaten meal on the table, tea grown cold in its pot, Abel's sketchbook left open to a page showing anatomical diagrams. But there were no signs of struggle, no indication that violence had occurred within the house's walls. The bedrooms were similarly undisturbed, though both beds appeared to have been slept in recently. It was the workshop that held the answers they sought, though neither man was prepared for what they would find there. The building's door stood slightly ajar, unusual for a workspace that normally remained securely locked when not in use. As they approached, Pastor Anselm noticed that the eternal dripping sound that characterized the workshop had stopped, replaced by a silence so complete it seemed to press against their ears like a physical weight. Inside, the workshop appeared to have been cleaned and organized with obsessive care. Every tool occupied its designated place. Every surface gleamed as if recently scrubbed. Every specimen stood in perfect arrangement along the walls. The oil lamps had burned out, but enough morning light filtered through the high windows to illuminate the scene that would haunt both men for the rest of their lives. In the workshop's center sat Elias Croft in his favorite armchair, positioned as if he were merely resting between tasks. His posture was natural, relaxed, his hands folded in his lap with the same precision he brought to all his work. His eyes were open, gazing toward the workshop door with an expression that might have been peaceful if not for the waxy, unnatural quality of his skin. Elias Croft was dead, but he had been preserved with the same meticulous skill he had applied to countless animal specimens. His body showed no signs of decay, no indication of the processes that normally claim the deceased. Instead, he possessed the terrible perfection of his own craft, a human being transformed into a work of art that celebrated and mocked the boundary between life and death. Silas Granger's practical nature asserted itself first, checking for signs of life despite the obvious futility of such efforts. But it was Pastor Anselm who noticed the details that revealed the true horror of what they were witnessing. Elias's clothing had been carefully arranged to conceal the evidence of the procedures that had transformed him from living man to preserved specimen, but close examination revealed the telltale signs: nearly invisible stitches along his collar, the slight discoloration that marked injection sites, the unnatural symmetry that suggested extensive internal preparation. The preservation work was flawless, demonstrating a level of skill that exceeded anything in Elias's previous portfolio. But what truly chilled the observers was the realization of what this perfection implied. The person responsible for this work possessed not only Elias's technical knowledge, but had surpassed the master in both precision and artistic vision. In a workshop where only two people had access to the necessary skills and materials, the identity of the artist was horrifyingly clear. The sheriff's ledger entry, recorded later that day, reflected the community's desperate need to impose a rational explanation on an irrational situation. E. Croft deceased. No inquest. Notify kin. The space reserved for listing next of kin remained blank, a small detail that spoke volumes about the isolation that had made such horrors possible. But beneath this official record lay the truth that neither Granger nor Anselm felt capable of recording in any public document. The official story would be one of a sudden death, but the evidence left behind in the boy's hiding place told a very different story. The search for Abel Croft began immediately after the discovery of his father's preserved corpse, but the boy seemed to have vanished as completely as morning mist. His clothes remained in his bedroom, his few possessions undisturbed, yet he had disappeared without leaving so much as a footprint in the frost that covered the settlement. It was only when Pastor Anselm began a systematic examination of the workshop that he discovered the hiding place that would reveal the true nature of what had occurred. Beneath a loose floorboard near the workshop's rear wall, Anselm found a collection of items that Abel had apparently hidden from his father's view. The cache included several additional sketchbooks, more advanced than the one found in the house, along with anatomical texts that seemed far too sophisticated for a child's education. But it was the final sketchbook, its pages filled with diagrams and notes that documented a horrific plan that provided the key to understanding the tragedy. The sketchbook's opening pages continued Abel's studies of human anatomy, but with a focus that had become increasingly specific and clinical. Detailed drawings showed the human circulatory system, the skeletal structure, the muscular arrangement, all rendered with scientific precision. But these were not merely academic studies, they were preparatory work for practical application. Blueprints for procedures that required intimate knowledge of human physiology. As the pages progressed, the drawings became more disturbing. Anatomical studies gave way to procedural diagrams showing injection sites, incision patterns, and preservation techniques. The margins contained chemical formulas written in Abel's careful handwriting, along with notes about timing, temperature, and the specific tools required for each step of the process. This was not the work of a student, but of someone preparing to become a practitioner, but it was the final pages that revealed the true horror of Abel's situation and the desperate nature of his response. A series of diagrams showed a complex, multi-figure tableau that bore uncomfortable resemblance to some of the workshop's more elaborate animal displays. The central figure was clearly meant to represent Elias, shown in the same relaxed pose that Pastor Anselm had discovered in the workshop. The precision of the planned positioning, the attention to detail in every aspect of the display, demonstrated that this was not a spontaneous act of violence, but a carefully orchestrated work of art. Most chilling were the notes that accompanied these final diagrams. Written in Abel's increasingly shaky handwriting, they documented his growing understanding of his father's true intentions. References to the ultimate specimen and the masterpiece that will surpass all others made clear that Elias had been grooming his son not just as an apprentice, but as the subject of his greatest work. The boy had discovered that his education in preservation techniques was actually preparation for his own transformation into a specimen. The diagrams revealed how Abel had turned his father's plan against him, using knowledge gained through forced instruction to create his own masterpiece. The stitching patterns shown in the sketches matched perfectly with the nearly invisible sutures found on Elias's preserved corpse. Every detail had been planned and executed with the precision Elias himself would have demanded. A final lesson that demonstrated the student had indeed surpassed the master. Perhaps most disturbing was the evidence of Abel's emotional state throughout the planning process. Early pages showed confident, steady line work, but as the diagrams progressed toward their final, horrible conclusion, the boy's handwriting became increasingly erratic. Tear stains marked several pages, and in some places the pencil had been pressed so hard it tore through the paper. This was not the work of a remorseless killer, but of a terrified child driven to desperate measures by circumstances beyond his control. The final page of the sketchbook contained a single sentence written in Abel's clearest handwriting: "Papa's lessons are complete." Below this, a small drawing showed two figures, one large and one small, with the larger figure now still and silent while the smaller one walked away into darkness. It was both a confession and a declaration of independence, the work of a child who had been forced to grow up too quickly and too completely. Hidden alongside the sketchbooks was a letter that Abel had apparently written but never sent, addressed to no one in particular but clearly intended as an explanation for his actions. The letter's contents, written in the formal style that characterized the Croft family's approach to communication, provided insight into the boy's mental state during the final days before his father's death. "I have learned everything Papa wanted to teach me," the letter began. "I understand now why he brought me to watch his work with the visitors who came at night. I know why he made me study the pictures in the books, why he showed me where to make the cuts and how to mix the chemicals. He was preparing me to be his greatest work, but I have chosen to make him mine instead." The sketchbook revealed the method, but it was the motive that would deliver the final, chilling twist. Pastor Anselm found Abel Croft 3 days after his father's death, huddled in a cave deep in the forest where the boy had apparently been sheltering since his disappearance. The child was weak from cold and hunger, his clothes torn by brambles, his face marked by exhaustion and something deeper, a weariness that belonged to someone far older than his 12 years. When the pastor called his name, Abel looked up with eyes that held no surprise, as if he had been waiting for this discovery. The confrontation between man of God and traumatized child took place in the cave's dim interior, with only filtered sunlight providing illumination for a conversation that would challenge everything Pastor Anselm believed about innocence, guilt, and the nature of evil. Abel did not run when the pastor approached, nor did he deny what he had done. Instead, he reached into his coat and withdrew the final sketchbook, opening it to pages that would provide the most chilling testimony of all. The pages Abel showed to Pastor Anselm contained not words, but images that told a story more complete than any written account. The first drawing showed a small figure labeled A standing beside a larger figure labeled E, with the larger figure holding what appeared to be a scalpel positioned near the smaller one's throat. The image was crude but unmistakably clear in its meaning. Abel had discovered that he was intended to be his father's next subject. The second drawing showed the same two figures, but now the scalpel had changed hands. The small figure held the blade while the large figure lay still, positioned exactly as Pastor Anselm had found Elias in the workshop. Between the two images, a transformation had occurred that spoke to desperation, survival, and the terrible education that had prepared Abel for this moment. Abel's finger trembled as he pointed to these drawings, his first attempt at communication since being discovered. When Pastor Anselm asked him to explain what the images meant, the boy's response came not in words but in gestures that conveyed a story of mounting terror and impossible choices. Through pantomime and the occasional whispered word, Abel revealed how he had gradually understood his father's true intentions. The realization had come gradually, Abel indicated, through overheard conversations between Elias and his clients, through observations of his father's increasingly clinical examination of his physical development, through the progression of his studies from animal anatomy to human physiology. The boy had understood that his education was nearing completion, and that completion would mark the end of his life as anything other than a perfectly preserved specimen in his father's collection. The confrontation between father and son, Abel revealed through his halting account, had occurred on the night of Elias's death. His father had finally made explicit what had long been implied. Abel was to be the masterpiece that would crown Elias's career, a work so perfect that it would establish his reputation among the most discerning collectors. The boy's preservation would be the ultimate demonstration of technique, a specimen that combined the innocence of childhood with the technical perfection that defined Elias's art. Abel's response to this revelation had been shaped entirely by the education his father had provided. Faced with the choice between becoming a victim or using his acquired skills to ensure survival, the boy had chosen the path his father had taught him. The preservation of Elias Croft was not an act of vengeance, but a demonstration of competence, a final examination that proved the student had mastered every aspect of the curriculum. The technical execution of his father's preservation, Abel indicated with obvious pride, despite his traumatized condition, had required every skill he had learned during his apprenticeship. The chemical preparation, the precise incisions, the careful positioning, all had been accomplished exactly as Elias would have demanded. In creating his father's death tableau, Abel had honored the standards of craftsmanship that had defined their relationship, even as he ended that relationship forever. But what emerged most clearly from Abel's account was not calculation, but terror. The boy had acted not from malice, but from the desperate recognition that his father's love had become indistinguishable from his artistic ambition. In Elias's mind, preserving his son was an act of devotion, a way of ensuring that Abel's beauty and innocence would never be touched by time or corruption. But for Abel, this devoted preservation meant only death, and he had chosen to reverse the roles rather than accept his assigned fate. The most heartbreaking moment of the confession came when Abel attempted to explain his feelings about what he had done. Through tears and broken words, he expressed not satisfaction but grief, mourning for the father he had loved, even as that same father planned his destruction. The boy understood that he had killed not just Elias, but also any possibility of normal childhood, any chance of growing up without the knowledge of what he was capable of doing to survive. When Pastor Anselm asked what Abel planned to do now, the boy's response was to point deeper into the forest, toward territories where no settlement existed and no law could reach. He had no intention of returning to Stillwater or surrendering himself to whatever justice the adult world might devise. The skills his father had taught him would serve him well in the wilderness, and his small size would make him difficult to track through terrain that had swallowed grown men without trace. In that moment, the pastor understood. He was not looking at a monster, but at a child who had used the only language his father had ever taught him to say no. The truth that emerged from Abel's confession forced Pastor Anselm to confront a reality that challenged every assumption he had made about the nature of good and evil, innocence and guilt, victim and perpetrator. The boy sitting before him in the cave's shadows was simultaneously a murderer and a survivor, a student and a master, a child, and something far more complex than childhood should allow. The categories that normally helped make sense of human behavior proved inadequate when applied to a situation so far beyond normal experience. As Pastor Anselm reflected on the evidence he had gathered, a different narrative began to emerge from the horror. Elias Croft had not been killed by a son's rebellion, but by the logical conclusion of his own educational program. Every skill Abel had used to preserve his father's corpse had been taught by Elias himself. Every technique had been demonstrated and practiced under the father's supervision. In a sense, Elias had created the instrument of his own destruction through the very process he believed would culminate in his greatest triumph. The preservation network that had operated in Stillwater revealed itself as something more complex than simple murder for profit. The wealthy collectors who purchased Elias's specimens were seeking not just forbidden objects, but works of art that transgressed the boundaries between life and death, beauty and horror, love and possession. In their private galleries, these men displayed human beings transformed into eternal tableaux, preserving moments of perfection that would otherwise be lost to time and decay. For Elias, the network had represented the ultimate validation of his artistic vision, a group of patrons who understood and appreciated the full scope of his talents. But the progression from animal specimens to human subjects had followed an internal logic that made Abel's fate inevitable. The boy represented the perfect subject, young enough to retain innocence, skilled enough to appreciate the artistry of his preservation, and intimate enough with the process to understand the honor being bestowed upon him. The tragedy lay not in Abel's response, but in the impossibility of any other response. A child raised from infancy to see preservation as the highest form of art, taught to value technical perfection above all other considerations, faced with the prospect of becoming a specimen himself, had only one logical choice. His father's education had prepared him perfectly for the situation Elias had created, though not in the way Elias had intended. Pastor Anselm's investigation had revealed that Silas Granger's role extended beyond simple procurement of victims. The foreman had served as the network's coordinator, managing not just the supply of subjects, but also the careful cultivation of Elias's artistic development. Granger had gradually introduced Elias to clients whose tastes ran toward ever more challenging commissions, nurturing the taxidermist's evolution from craftsman to artist to something approaching a philosopher of preservation. The correspondence found in Granger's papers revealed a systematic approach to what the participants called the ultimate art form. Letters discussed not just technique, but theory, exploring questions about the relationship between death and beauty, preservation and love, art and morality. For these men, the transformation of human subjects into preserved specimens represented a form of aesthetic transcendence, a way of creating beauty that existed beyond conventional moral categories. Abel's discovery of his intended fate had disrupted this carefully constructed world, but his response had also validated its central premise. The boy's preservation of his father demonstrated mastery of the techniques and appreciation of the artistry that defined the network's activities. In killing Elias, Abel had not rejected his father's teaching, but had proven himself worthy of admission to a community of artists who dealt in the most exclusive medium imaginable. The cover-up that followed Elias's death reflected not just fear of legal consequences, but recognition that Abel's work represented something unprecedented in the network's experience. A 12-year-old child had produced a specimen of quality that surpassed anything previously achieved by adult practitioners. The implications of this achievement, both artistic and moral, challenged assumptions that even these transgressive men found difficult to accept. Silas Granger's decision to burn the workshop and destroy the evidence reflected his understanding that Abel's survival posed a threat to the entire network. A child who had mastered their techniques and demonstrated willingness to use them against authority figures could not be allowed to disappear into the wilderness with knowledge that could destroy careers and lives. Throughout the Eastern establishment, the official story of Elias's sudden death served to protect not just local reputations, but a network of influence that extended far beyond Stillwater. Cross-referencing the Granger correspondence with the sheriff's ledger revealed the coordination required to maintain this conspiracy of silence. The authorities had been convinced to forego investigation. The local newspaper had been provided with sanitized facts, and the community had been encouraged to treat the Croft tragedy as a closed matter best forgotten. Every aspect of the cover-up had been designed to protect interests that extended far beyond the valley's borders. With the truth buried by the town and the boy vanished into the woods, the story should have ended there. But legends have a way of persisting. The official response to Elias Croft's death revealed the extent to which Stillwater's leadership was prepared to sacrifice truth for stability and self-preservation. Within hours of the body's discovery, Silas Granger had initiated a coordinated effort to control information, manage witnesses, and create a narrative that would satisfy outside authorities while protecting the interests of those who had profited from the Preservation Network's activities. The first step in this cover-up was the removal of evidence from the Croft workshop. Under Granger's supervision, a team of men stripped the building of its contents, loading wagons with specimens, tools, chemicals, and documents that might reveal the true nature of Elias's work. The valuable specimens were quietly distributed among private collectors, while potentially incriminating materials were destroyed or hidden in locations known only to Granger himself. Dr. Alistair Finch, the county coroner whose medical expertise had been essential to the network's operations, played a crucial role in establishing the official cause of Elias's death. Finch's examination was deliberately superficial, designed to support a predetermined conclusion rather than uncover inconvenient truths. His report cited sudden cardiac failure as the cause of death, a diagnosis that required no further investigation and suggested no criminal activity. The decision to forego an inquest reflected careful coordination between local and county authorities, facilitated by relationships that had been cultivated over years of mutually beneficial cooperation. Sheriff's deputies who might have asked uncomfortable questions were assigned to other duties, while officials who understood the importance of discretion handled all matters related to the Croft case. The investigation that should have followed such an unusual death was quietly abandoned before it began. Pastor Anselm's attempts to raise questions about the official narrative were discouraged through a combination of professional pressure and personal threats. Church authorities, responding to complaints about the pastor's unhealthy fascination with morbid matters, suggested that his ministry in Stillwater might benefit from a period of reflection and prayer in more settled surroundings. The message was clear. Continued investigation would result in removal from his position and professional disgrace. The burning of the Croft workshop represented the final phase of the evidence destruction, ostensibly conducted for public health reasons, to eliminate the lingering chemical contamination that made the building unsafe. The fire conveniently destroyed any remaining traces of the activities that had taken place there. Witnesses reported that the fire burned with unusual intensity and strange colors, suggesting that accelerants had been used to ensure complete destruction. The local newspaper's coverage of these events reflected the careful management of public information. The Stillwater Ledger's article, published 3 days after Elias's death, presented a sanitized version of events that emphasized the taxidermist's contributions to the community while glossing over the circumstances of his death. References to Abel were minimal, describing him only as a grieving son who has sought solitude in the wilderness during this difficult time. Community response to the official narrative revealed the extent to which Stillwater's residents understood and accepted the need for discretion. Those who had harbored suspicions about the Croft family's activities kept their concerns private, recognizing that public discussion could bring unwanted attention from outside authorities. The conspiracy of silence was maintained not through coercion but through collective understanding of shared vulnerability. Behind the scenes, the Preservation Network moved quickly to minimize their exposure and protect their investments. Wealthy collectors who had purchased specimens from Elias were advised to store their acquisitions discreetly until public attention shifted to other matters. Communication between network members was suspended temporarily, while plans were made to establish new supply chains that would be less vulnerable to disruption. The search for Abel Croft was conducted with deliberate inefficiency, designed to satisfy public expectations while ensuring the boy remained free to disappear permanently into the wilderness. Search parties were given outdated information about his possible location, while areas where he might actually be hiding were quietly avoided. The official position was that a traumatized child posed no threat to anyone and deserved compassion rather than pursuit. Before we continue with what happened next, I need to ask you something. Have you ever wondered how many secrets a small community can bury before the weight of them becomes unbearable? If you're finding this story as disturbing as I am, subscribe so you don't miss the truths that powerful people work so hard to hide. The most chilling aspect of the cover-up was its efficiency and completeness. Within a month of Elias's death, all physical evidence of the Preservation Network had been eliminated or hidden. All witnesses had been silenced or discredited, and all official records reflected a carefully crafted fiction. The only remaining trace of the truth was a traumatized child somewhere in the wilderness, carrying knowledge that powerful men desperately wanted to see buried forever. Financial records from the period show a pattern of payments and transfers that suggest the cover-up's costs were shared among network members, ensuring that no single individual bore the entire burden of protecting their collective secret. The efficiency of this financial coordination revealed the depth of planning that had gone into contingency preparations for exactly this type of crisis. The record was wiped clean, but in the dark of the Blackroot Valley, whispers of the boy who stitched flesh began to take on a new life. The legend of Abel Croft did not die with the destruction of the workshop or the official suppression of the truth. Instead, it evolved and adapted, taking on new forms as decades passed and the original events faded into the realm of folklore. The boy who had learned to preserve flesh became a figure of regional mythology, a cautionary tale that parents used to keep children from wandering too far into the forest, and eventually a subject of fascination for those drawn to stories of transgression and survival. The first reported sighting occurred in 1922, when a hunter named Thomas Whitmore claimed to have encountered a wax-like man deep in the Blackroot Valley's unexplored regions. Whitmore's account, recorded in a letter to the local newspaper, described a figure that seemed human but moved with unnatural stillness, as if every gesture had been carefully planned and positioned. The figure had observed Whitmore from a distance before melting back into the forest shadows, leaving behind only the impression of being watched by something that understood concealment better than any living creature should. Similar sightings followed over the years, each adding new details to the growing legend. A trapper in 1931 reported finding a campsite where everything had been arranged with obsessive precision, every item positioned exactly parallel or perpendicular to every other item, as if the camp's occupant could not tolerate any deviation from perfect order. The trapper's description of preserved animal parts, arranged in artistic tableaux around the campsite, suggested someone who continued to practice the skills learned in childhood. The most disturbing incident occurred in 1954, when a geological survey team discovered the body of their missing colleague positioned against a large pine tree in what appeared to be a carefully composed tableau. The victim showed no signs of violence or struggle, but investigators noted the unusually meticulous stitching that had been used to repair a minor wound on the man's arm. The positioning of the body, the quality of preservation, and the artistic arrangement of surrounding objects all suggested the work of someone with professional training in human preservation techniques. Local authorities investigating the geologist's death found evidence of a temporary camp nearby, equipped with tools and chemicals that would have been familiar to anyone who had observed Elias Croft's workshop decades earlier. The camp's organization displayed the same obsessive attention to detail noted in previous sightings, while the preservation equipment suggested someone who had continued to refine and improve techniques learned long ago. Modern folklore surrounding the Flesh Stitcher has incorporated these various sightings into a comprehensive mythology that portrays Abel Croft as an eternal wanderer, forever practicing the arts his father taught him, but applying them according to his own aesthetic vision. Unlike the commercial network his father had served, this figure is described as an artist working for purely personal satisfaction, creating works that no one will ever purchase or display, but that reflect a dedication to craft that transcends ordinary human motivation. Psychologists who have studied the Abel Croft legend note its appeal to contemporary anxieties about childhood trauma, survival, and the ways in which early experiences can shape entire lives. The story resonates with modern understanding of how victims can become perpetrators, how survival skills learned in childhood can become lifelong patterns of behavior, and how individuals can disappear into society's margins while maintaining complex internal lives that reflect their unique histories. The development of amateur investigation communities, facilitated by modern communication technology, has brought new attention to the Croft case and similar historical incidents. Online forums dedicated to historical true crime have produced detailed analyses of the available evidence, creating elaborate theories about Abel's survival and the modern activities he might be pursuing. Some investigators claim to have identified patterns in contemporary missing person cases that suggest the continued operation of preservation networks serving wealthy collectors. Photography and video evidence purporting to show the adult Abel Croft appears regularly on social media platforms, though analysis typically reveals these images to be either hoaxes or misidentifications of unrelated individuals. The most convincing photograph, taken by a hiking enthusiast in the Blackroot Valley during the summer of 2019, shows a distant figure whose posture and positioning seem deliberately artistic, as if the subject were posing for an invisible sculptor. The commercialization of the Abel Croft legend has produced tourist attractions, books, documentaries, and merchandise that capitalize on public fascination with the story. The town that eventually replaced Stillwater markets itself as the home of the Flesh Stitcher legend, complete with museum displays, guided tours, and annual festivals that celebrate the area's unique cultural heritage. The transformation of genuine horror into entertainment reflects society's ability to domesticate even the most disturbing historical events. But beneath the commercial exploitation and folklore embellishment, serious researchers continue to investigate the possibility that Abel Croft survived his childhood trauma and developed into something unprecedented in criminal history. The combination of technical skill, artistic vision, and complete social invisibility would make him an ideal predator, capable of operating for decades without detection while satisfying compulsions rooted in the most formative experiences of his life. The legend outlived the facts, transforming a story of survival into a warning for anyone who dares to wander too far from the path. In the end, after decades of investigation, speculation, and myth-making, only one piece of evidence remains undisputed. Abel Croft's sketchbook, discovered in his hiding place beneath the workshop floor and preserved by Pastor Anselm until his own death 40 years later. The sketchbook, now housed in a private collection, represents the most authentic record of what happened in Stillwater during those terrible months of 1908. The first page of the sketchbook bears a simple inscription in a child's careful handwriting, "Papa's Lessons." These two words encapsulate the entire tragedy, suggesting both innocence and corruption, education and exploitation, love and horror. They represent the voice of a 12-year-old boy trying to make sense of experiences that no child should endure. Using language that reflects both his limited vocabulary and his premature understanding of adult evil. The pages that follow document not just the technical aspects of preservation, but the emotional journey of a child discovering that his father's love was indistinguishable from artistic ambition. The progression from simple animal studies to complex human anatomical diagrams charts Abel's loss of innocence in precise detail, showing how knowledge that should have empowered him instead revealed the full extent of his vulnerability. What emerges most clearly from the sketchbook's pages is not the mind of a monster, but the desperate calculations of a child trapped in an impossible situation. Every diagram, every note, every carefully planned procedure reflects Abel's growing understanding that his survival depended on mastering skills his father had taught him for completely different purposes. The sketches document not the birth of a killer, but the transformation of a victim into someone capable of refusing victimhood through the only means available. Modern psychological analysis of the sketchbook has revealed layers of meaning that were invisible to contemporary observers. The progression of Abel's artistic development, the increasing sophistication of his technical knowledge, and the emotional content expressed through line weight and composition all suggest a child whose intellectual gifts were being systematically exploited by an adult who should have been protecting him. The final pages of the sketchbook contain Abel's masterwork, the precise diagrams that guided his preservation of his father's corpse. These drawings represent not just technical achievement, but artistic vision, demonstrating that the boy had surpassed his teacher in both skill and imagination. The careful positioning of Elias's body, the attention to aesthetic detail, and the flawless execution of complex procedures all reflect standards of craftsmanship that would have made any artist proud. But perhaps most significantly, the sketchbook reveals Abel's understanding of what he had become through his father's teaching. The boy who drew those diagrams knew that he was no longer simply a child, but something unprecedented, a human being who had been taught to see other humans as raw material for artistic expression, and who had proven himself willing and able to act on that teaching when his survival depended on it. The sketchbook's preservation by Pastor Anselm reflects the minister's belief that some truths are too important to suppress even when they challenge comfortable assumptions about innocence and guilt. By ensuring the sketchbook's survival, Anselm created a record that would continue to disturb and educate long after the original participants had passed from memory into legend. Contemporary scholars who have studied the sketchbook note its unique position in the literature of childhood trauma and survival. No other document provides such detailed insight into the mind of a child forced to become both student and practitioner of techniques designed to transform living beings into objects of artistic contemplation. The sketchbook stands as testimony to the human capacity for adaptation under the most extreme circumstances, while also serving as a warning about the consequences of treating children as extensions of adult ambitions rather than as individuals deserving protection. The ultimate truth preserved in those yellowed pages is that a child was taught to see people as things, and he learned his lesson all too well. The sound of a single final drop of liquid falling echoes through the decades, marking the moment when innocence ended and something else began.